Walk into any PC hardware store today and something feels off. Brands like EVGA, Zotac, or PNY don't spark excitement anymore. These were once safe picks, familiar, reliable. Now, people scroll past them without even realizing it. When GPUs stopped being casual upgrades and turned into costly, high-stakes decisions, buyer behavior changed. The entire market adjusted, but not every brand adjusted with it. In this video, we're going to look at the GPU brands people quietly walked away from, how that shift happened, and why some of these names may never matter again. To understand why people stopped buying certain GPU brands, you have to go back to when brand choice actually felt important. When GPU brands actually meant something. Picking the wrong brand didn't just mean disappointment, it meant noise issues, heat problems, poor support, or a card you regretted for years. Back then, GPU brands had clear identities. Some were known for durability, others for aggressive cooling, others for being the safest recommendation you could give a friend who didn't want surprises. Buyers weren't memorizing benchmarks, they were relying on reputation, because reputation saved you from risk. And that reputation wasn't marketing. It was earned through consistency, through products that worked as expected, RMAs that didn't turn into nightmares, and designs that didn't feel like experiments. When a brand got that right, people noticed. When it got it wrong, people remembered. That's why brand loyalty existed in the first place. Not because buyers were irrational, but because GPUs used to be upgrades you felt confident making. The downside of choosing wrong was manageable, and the upside felt worth it. Here's why that context matters. GPU brands didn't start losing customers when they suddenly made worse products. They started losing customers when the rules of buying a GPU changed. In the next section, we're going to look at the exact moment that shift happened, why it caught so many brands off guard, and how one change in buyer behavior quietly separated the brands that would survive from the ones people would slowly stop choosing. The upgrade cycle broke, and everything changed with it. For a long time, upgrading your GPU felt optional. You did it when a new game pushed your system a little too hard, when performance started to dip, or sometimes just because something new and exciting showed up. If you made a mediocre choice, it was annoying, but it wasn't devastating. You could swap it out in a year or two and move on without much regret. That entire dynamic quietly collapsed. As GPU prices climbed and availability tightened, upgrades stopped being casual. They turned into long-term decisions you had to live with. Suddenly, you weren't buying a graphics card for the next few months. You were buying it for the next several years. And that changed the questions people asked before clicking buy. Instead of, will this run my games? The question became, what happens if this card has issues? Noise levels mattered more. Cooling design mattered more. Warranty support mattered more. Even small flaws felt amplified when you knew you couldn't easily replace the card without taking a financial hit. This is where buyer behavior fundamentally shifted. People became more conservative, more skeptical, and far less willing to experiment. Brand reputation stopped being a bonus and became a form of insurance. Buyers weren't chasing the best deal anymore. They were trying to avoid the worst outcome. Some GPU brands understood this immediately. They adjusted their messaging, tightened quality control, and leaned into reliability. Others kept acting like the market hadn't changed at all. They priced aggressively, cut corners, or assumed brand familiarity would carry them through. It didn't. Once GPUs became high-stakes purchases, uncertainty became toxic. A single negative experience carried more weight than 10 good ones, and brands that failed to adapt didn't lose customers in dramatic waves. They lost them slowly, through hesitation, second-guessing, and skipped launches. By the time those brands noticed the decline, buyers had already moved on, and that shift sets up the next problem. Because when buyers get more cautious, budget stops meaning what it used to. When affordable stopped meaning worth it. As GPU buyers became more cautious, the first brands to feel the pressure were the ones positioned as affordable alternatives. For years, that positioning worked. These brands weren't perfect, but they were cheaper, and when GPUs were easy to replace, that trade-off made sense. Once prices climbed, that logic fell apart. When a graphics card costs enough to feel like an investment, every compromise matters more. Fan noise that you might have tolerated before becomes a constant annoyance. Slightly higher temperatures turn into long-term concerns, and any uncertainty around build quality starts to feel like a gamble instead of a deal. This is where buyer psychology shifted. Saving a small amount upfront stopped feeling responsible. People began thinking in terms of total risk rather than sticker price. A cheaper card wasn't actually cheaper if it meant downtime, return headaches, or the possibility of needing a replacement you couldn't easily afford. Online discussion amplified this change. Individual complaints didn't stay isolated anymore. A single negative post could sit at the top of a forum for years, quietly shaping perception. Even buyers who never experienced issues themselves started absorbing that caution secondhand. And once a brand is associated with risk, it doesn't take many stories to reinforce it. People stop recommending it just to be safe. Then they stop mentioning it altogether. That silence spreads faster than outrage ever could. Some brands tried to fight this by pushing prices even lower, hoping discounts would compensate for trust. But that move backfired. It signaled desperation rather than value, and it reinforced the idea that something had to be wrong for the price to be that low. At that point, affordability stopped being a strength. It became a warning sign. When a brand reaches that stage, the problem isn't performance anymore, it's confidence, which sets the stage for the next misstep, when prices started rising without trust rising alongside them. When the prices went up, but the confidence didn't. As costs increased across the GPU industry, price hikes were inevitable. Manufacturing became more expensive, supply chains tightened, and margins shrank. On the surface, it made sense that graphics cards would cost more. Most buyers understood that reality. What they didn't understand was why some brands suddenly wanted premium money without offering premium reassurance. This is where the disconnect started. For years, certain GPU brands positioned themselves as the affordable alternative. They weren't perfect, but they were cheaper, and that discount justified the trade-offs. Once prices rose, that justification disappeared. Buyers were no longer comparing a budget option to a premium one. They were comparing two expensive options side by side. And at that point, performance stopped being the deciding factor. When prices are high, people don't buy numbers on a spec sheet. They buy confidence. They buy the feeling that if something goes wrong, the company will stand behind the product. They buy predictability. And some brands simply didn't have that reputation to lean on. This created an uncomfortable moment for buyers. A mid-tier brand charging close to the same price as a more trusted competitor suddenly felt like a bad deal, even if the hardware itself was fine. The risk wasn't visible, but it was felt. And when you're spending serious money, even perceived risk is enough to push you away. What made this worse was that these price increases happened at the exact wrong time. Buyers were already more cautious, already upgrading less frequently, already reading more reviews than ever before. That meant every weakness was magnified, every complaint carried more weight, every unanswered support ticket became part of the brand's story. Some companies tried to compensate by leaning on marketing, better packaging, flashier branding, aggressive launch messaging, but marketing can't replace trust. It can only draw attention to the gap when expectations aren't met. Over time, this led to a subtle but damaging habit. Buyers stopped actively comparing these brands. They didn't argue about them. They didn't criticize them loudly. They simply stopped considering them as viable options when prices crossed a certain threshold. And once a brand becomes mentally filtered out at checkout, it's incredibly hard to get back in. Even reasonable pricing doesn't fix it, because the issue isn't cost anymore, it's credibility. That's when the damage stops being temporary, and that's when a single bad experience can do something far worse than before. It can end the conversation entirely. When one bad experience became a brand killer. There was a time when a bad GPU experience stayed small. You might complain to a friend, post once on a forum, and then move on. The brand took a hit, but it recovered. Failures were isolated. Context mattered. That world is gone. Today, every bad experience leaves a permanent trail, a failed fan, a card that dies just outside the return window, an RMA process that stretches on for weeks, support tickets that get bounced between departments or answered with copy-paste replies. Individually, none of these are shocking. Every manufacturer has defects. What changed is how visible and searchable those moments became. Modern buyers don't just skim reviews anymore. They research defensively. They search brand names next to words like RMA, support, coil wine, or dead card. They scroll through forum threads from years ago, and when they see the same complaints repeated, even if they're not constant, it creates a background noise of doubt. That doubt is devastating. A single negative experience doesn't need to go viral to do damage. It just needs to exist long enough to be discovered by someone who's already on the fence. Over time, those isolated stories stack up and form a pattern in the buyer's mind, even if the brand's overall failure rate isn't dramatically worse than anyone else's. What makes this even more brutal is how silence is interpreted. When companies don't acknowledge issues publicly, don't explain delays, or don't show any urgency in support channels, buyers don't give them the benefit of the doubt. They assume neglect. And that assumption spreads quietly through comments, replies, and recommendations that never get written. At that point, brands aren't losing customers because of performance. They're losing them because people no longer trust the outcome if something goes wrong. And once trust disappears, no amount of benchmarking or spec sheet wins can bring it back. Before we keep going, if this breakdown is helping you see how GPU brands actually rise and fall beyond marketing and specs, hit the like button and subscribe. It helps more people make smarter decisions before spending serious money. Because the next part of this story goes even deeper. The problem wasn't just bad experiences or poor support. It was that some GPU brands completely lost track of who they were actually building these products for. And once that happens, decline becomes almost inevitable. They lost track of who they were building GPUs for. As the GPU market became more expensive and buyers became more cautious, something subtle started happening inside certain brands. They stopped building products around real users and started building products around internal assumptions, trends, and short-term incentives. For a long time, the customer was easy to define. Gamers wanted stable performance, good thermals, low noise, and hardware that felt thoughtfully engineered. Enthusiasts wanted reliability they could push without fear. Casual buyers wanted something that just worked without turning into a tech support project. Then priorities shifted. Some brands began chasing whatever looked profitable in the moment. Crypto mining booms, influencer marketing trends, niche features that looked good on spec sheets. These started shaping products more than actual user behavior. Instead of asking, what problems do gamers actually have? The question quietly became, what can we sell this generation? The result was GPUs that felt disconnected from reality. You'd see cards with extreme RGB designs, oversized shrouds, or gimmicky features that looked impressive in marketing photos, but didn't solve the core issues buyers cared about. Meanwhile, practical things like fan quality, thermal consistency, firmware stability, and long-term reliability sometimes took a back seat. From the buyer's perspective, this created confusion. These products weren't terrible. They just didn't feel purpose-built. They felt like they were designed by committee for a customer that didn't quite exist. And when you're spending serious money, confusion is enough to push you away. Buyers started asking questions like, who is this card for? Why does this model exist? What problem is it solving better than the competition? When there were no clear answers, people defaulted to safer brands. Brands that felt boring, predictable, and grounded in actual user needs. In a high-risk market, boring becomes a feature. This misalignment also created a perception problem. Each generation that felt out of touch reinforced the idea that the brand didn't understand its audience anymore. Even if the next product improved, the mental model had already shifted. Buyers assumed future products would miss the mark too. And once that assumption sets in, it's incredibly hard to reverse. You're no longer fighting a performance gap. You're fighting a perception gap. Some brands tried to fix this by adding more features, more SKUs, more marketing language, but more complexity didn't restore clarity. It made the lineup harder to understand, and it diluted the identity even further. Meanwhile, the brands that did understand their customers weren't doing anything flashy. They focused on consistent thermals, predictable noise levels, straightforward product tiers, and reliable support. They didn't chase every trend. They reinforced trust. And that's the key difference. Losing track of your customer doesn't cause a dramatic collapse. It causes a slow erosion. People stop getting excited. Then they stop recommending. Then they stop considering. By the time sales drop, the audience is already gone. And while some brands were drifting away from their buyers, others were quietly doing the opposite, staying painfully consistent, almost boringly reliable, which is exactly why they survived. How the survivors won without doing anything. Flashy. While some GPU brands were slowly losing relevance, others were quietly doing the opposite. They weren't dominating headlines or reinventing graphics cards. In many cases, they weren't even particularly exciting, but they were consistent. And in a market defined by high prices and low tolerance for risk, consistency became a competitive advantage. These surviving brands focused on predictability. Buyers knew what to expect from their products before they ever opened the box. Cooling performance landed within a familiar range. Noise levels didn't surprise anyone. Build quality felt refined but not experimental. Nothing felt like a gamble. That reliability mattered more than raw innovation. As GPUs became long-term purchases, buyers started valuing stability over novelty. A card that performed slightly worse on paper but behaved exactly as expected was often more appealing than one that promised big gains with unknown downsides. In that environment, boring wasn't a weakness. It was reassurance. Another key difference was how these brands communicated. They didn't flood buyers with confusing model names or endless variants. Product lineups stayed relatively simple. Each tier had a clear purpose. Buyers didn't have to decode which version was safe to buy. Support visibility played a role too. Even if buyers never personally used customer support, knowing it existed and that others had successfully used it reduced anxiety. Transparency mattered. Silence didn't. Over time, this approach reshaped buying habits. These brands became default recommendations, not because they inspired passion, but because they removed doubt. They were the names people mentioned when asked, "What should I get if I just want it to work?" Meanwhile, struggling brands often did the opposite. They overcomplicated their lineups, changed identities between generations, or leaned too heavily on marketing to compensate for trust gaps. That made them harder to understand and easier to avoid. The most telling sign was how discussion around these brands changed. Survivors weren't constantly defended online. They didn't need to be. Their reputation did the work for them. Fading brands, on the other hand, were either constantly debated or not mentioned at all, and silence is the worst outcome. Eventually, that difference showed up in places buyers rarely notice. Retailers adjusted shelf space. Online stores reduced SKUs. Restocks became less frequent, not because of a single failure, but because demand was no longer reliable. By the time consumers sensed something was off, retailers had already made their decision. And that quiet pullback leads directly to the next warning sign, the one most people miss until a brand is already on its way out. The retail warning signs. Most buyers never see. By the time most buyers sense that a GPU brand is fading, the outcome has already been decided somewhere else. Not on Reddit, not in YouTube comments, but inside retail systems that track demand long before consumers consciously notice a shift. Retailers don't run on opinions, they run on movement. When a GPU brand is healthy, its products sell at a predictable pace. Inventory turns over consistently, restocks are planned. Multiple SKUs remain active because buyers keep choosing them without hesitation. Even when demand dips temporarily, retailers feel confident it will recover. When that confidence disappears, behavior changes quietly. A GPU model sells out and doesn't get reordered. A brand that once had an entire lineup slowly gets reduced to a handful of listings. New generations launch with fewer variants. Discounts start appearing earlier, and more often not as promotions, but as attempts to clear inventory that isn't moving. To consumers, none of this feels dramatic. It looks like normal market fluctuation. But to retailers, it's a clear signal. Demand is no longer reliable. Shelf space, physical or digital, is valuable. Retailers don't gamble on brands that hesitate. If customers aren't choosing a product confidently, retailers stop committing inventory to it. They order smaller quantities. They test instead of invest. And if those tests fail, they quietly shift attention elsewhere. This is where decline accelerates. Reduced shelf presence means fewer chances for a buyer to even consider the brand. Fewer listings mean fewer comparisons. Over time, the brand stops appearing in recommended sections, stops being part of bundles, stops showing up as a default option. Visibility drops, which reinforces the perception that the brand doesn't matter anymore. What's important is that none of this requires outrage or failure. Retailers don't need scandals to pull back. All they need is hesitation. Slow movement is enough. And once a retailer disengages, it becomes incredibly difficult for a brand to regain momentum. Even a decent product launch struggles if retailers aren't willing to stock it aggressively. Without visibility, buyers never get the chance to reconsider. This is why so many GPU brands don't collapse publicly. There's no announcement, no apology, no clear ending. They simply become harder to find, less discussed, and eventually irrelevant. At this stage, the decline is no longer theoretical, because now we can stop talking in general terms. We can talk about names. In the next section, we're going to look directly at which GPU brands people have actually walked away from, how they ended up here, and why these names keep coming up when buyers talk about what they won't buy anymore. The brands. People quietly stopped buying. By this point, the pattern is clear, so now it makes sense to stop speaking in general terms and talk about specific names. Not because these brands are disasters, but because they perfectly illustrate how relevance is lost without drama. This isn't about boycotts or outrage. These are brands people didn't get mad at. They simply stopped choosing them, and that's far more damaging. Take EVGA. For years, EVGA represented the gold standard for how to treat customers. Strong warranties, visible support, and a community that actively defended the brand. When EVGA exited the GPU market, it didn't just remove a trusted option, it quietly changed buyer psychology. People didn't replace EVGA with another emotional favorite. They replaced it with caution, and once that caution set in, it didn't stay isolated. Then there's Zotac. Zotac didn't collapse or implode. It slowly faded into the background. For many buyers, it became the brand they recognized, but never actively considered. Not bad enough to warn others away from, but not compelling enough to choose when prices rose and safer options were available. In a market where every purchase feels risky, being neutral is a disadvantage. PNY falls into a similar category. It has long existed without a strong identity in the consumer GPU space. Known, but rarely discussed. Available, but seldom recommended. As GPUs became more expensive, that lack of a clear reason to buy became impossible to ignore. When buyers can't quickly explain why they should trust a brand, they default to one they already understand. What all of these brands share isn't poor performance or catastrophic failure. It's the absence of a compelling reason to choose them when the stakes increased. Their products weren't broken. They were easy to skip. And that's how relevance really disappears. Fewer recommendations lead to fewer sales. Fewer sales reduce retail presence. Reduced presence reinforces the idea that the brand doesn't matter anymore. The cycle feeds itself. The most telling sign isn't criticism, it's silence. When no one feels the need to defend a brand, when its absence barely registers, that's when it stops being part of the conversation. Which leaves one final question. If this is how GPU brands fade away, is there any realistic path back? Why comebacks almost never happen? Once a GPU brand reaches the stage we've been describing, recovery becomes extremely difficult. Not because it's impossible to make better products, but because the damage isn't technical anymore. It's psychological. By the time buyers stop choosing a brand, they've already rewritten their mental shortlist. That brand isn't being evaluated or compared. It's being ignored, and regaining attention is much harder than fixing performance issues. To truly come back, a brand would need years of consistent execution. Not one good generation, but several in a row. Clear pricing, predictable quality, visible support improvements, and most importantly, time. Trust doesn't reset quickly, especially when GPUs are expensive purchases people make infrequently. The problem is that most brands don't have that runway. Margins are thin. Retailers are cautious. Every generation that underperforms tightens the window even further. By the time meaningful improvements arrive, the audience has already formed habits around other brands. Nostalgia doesn't help much either. Buyers might remember a brand fondly, but they won't risk hundreds of dollars on memories. In a market where caution dominates, history only matters if it's recent and consistent. That's why comebacks are rare. Not because companies don't try, but because relevance, once lost, is expensive to rebuild. And most brands fade out long before they get the chance. These GPU brands weren't killed by one bad product or a single mistake. They were worn down by small missteps, changing buyer behavior, and an inability to adapt when the stakes rose. Consumers didn't suddenly become harsher. They became more careful, and in a high-risk market, brands that don't inspire confidence get filtered out quietly. That's the real story here, not collapse, erosion. So if you're shopping for a GPU today, the lesson isn't to chase hype or avoid specific names blindly. It's to pay attention to patterns, to notice which brands people trust without thinking, and which ones require justification. Because in this market, being ignored is the beginning of the end. Which GPU brand did you quietly stop buying, and why? Drop it in the comments. And if this video helped you think differently about how GPU brands actually rise and fall, consider subscribing. More of this kind of breakdown is coming.